The US presidential election is over, but the result has turned into high drama and controversy. President Donald Trump continues to claim voting fraud, but those claims have been dismissed as unfounded by his own election officials, who say the vote was the most secure in American history. Meanwhile, the Democratic winner and president-elect Joe Biden is pressing ahead with picking his cabinet. Donald Trump has appeared for just one public engagement since his election defeat, seen here at Arlington honouring America's war dead on Remembrance Day. But he's kept up his social media onslaught with a torrent of tweets about his unfounded claims. Joe Biden has called Donald Trump's behaviour embarrassing.
We are already beginning the transition. We're well underway. And the ability for the administration in any way by failure to recognize our win does not change the dynamic at all in what we're able to do. I just think it's an embarrassment, quite frankly. The only thing that, how can I say this tactfully? I think it will not help the president's legacy.
Well, we will be covering all of this with the help of the British journalist Ian Woods, who has been reporting on US politics since 2001 and has covered the 4 previous presidential elections. Thank you very much, as always, for being in the studio with us. I'm also joined by Tanya Washington, who is a professor of Georgia State University College of Law, and also by 2 Republicans, one at the moment. We're hoping to speak to Sol Montez Bradley shortly. He's a senior fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy in Virginia. But we definitely have in Minnesota, political strategist Amy Koch. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the show. So let me start with you, Amy. What do you make and how do you feel about the way that President Trump has refused to concede this election?
Well, I don't have so much concern about his refusal to concede at this point. It was a very close election. It was very remarkable in the number of mail-in ballots. And so I think if they have actual proof of irregularities and to follow through on those, that's a reasonable thing to do. But to this point, I would say I just haven't seen any evidence that backs up these claims, and that can't continue. So at some point, the president and his team is just going to have to acknowledge that. They've gotten thrown out of court already in Georgia. Nevada's been, they said 10,000, they provided kind of 3,000 with no evidence. Eventually, they're just going to have to either put up the evidence or move along, because peaceful transition and an election is what's happening. So I think I support the idea that they follow through on anything that they believe and have evidence of. But after that, Joe Biden, who has been declared the victor, and I actually believe he will be upheld in that, will transition to the presidency.
And Sol Montez Bradley is now with us. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. So Amy there said that the Republicans should just move along. What do you think about President Trump's reaction to this election result?
Well, first, thank you for having me back, and a pleasure to be here. I question the way the question is made. Why has President Trump refused to concede? To concede what? The election is still going on. 5 states are disputed. Georgia is going to a recount. A judge has ordered the segregation and not counting on certain votes in Pennsylvania. And this goes on. What country in the world proclaims a president based on press reports? No president-elect exists until the Electoral College so determines. May I remind people of President Tilden, or Dewey, or Gore, all of whom went to sleep with press reports that made him president-elect, and all of whom lost. There is no end to the election until the Electoral College meets. President Trump is not conceding because there is nothing to concede in an election where 0.03% of the votes may or may not turn it. So I suggest this is a time not for people to proclaim themselves president and create the office of the president-elect as if such contraption existed. throwing gasoline on the flames, but a time to be calm, to be collected, to know that these things happen from time to time, and to welcome recounts that will erase any doubt. We cannot have a country where half of the country believes the election was stolen one way or the other. And the only way to do that is to follow the proper procedures, to have the recounts, to determine without a shadow of a doubt who the president-elect is. And then it will be time for congratulations and concessions, not before.
Well, let's bring in Tanya Washington. As a Democrat, what do you make of this whole situation? And is it right to follow the proper procedure, as Sol has just said there?
Well, before I'm a Democrat, I'm an American and a law professor. And I agree that we do need to follow the process and procedures. We need to make sure that all the votes are certified. He is entitled to a recount. And there's some places where a recount is just by virtue of the narrow number of votes between the two candidates is automatic. Georgia is one of those places. And once we have a final victor, as stated by our Electoral College, then it will be time for a concession. However, I also think it is inappropriate to inflame the passions of people by charging that the election has been fraudulent, that it's being stolen, that dead people are voting. Like, these are all the inflammatory comments that are being made that throw gasoline on the fire of people's passion. And I think it's dangerous for our democracy.
And Ian Woods is with me in the studio. So we said in the beginning that the result has turned into high drama and controversy. What do you make of all this?
Well, Sol was saying a few moments ago that what country declares its election results or allows the media to declare its election results? Well, the answer is America, has done for the last decades. That's how Donald Trump was elected president. Yes, all the votes were eventually counted, and yes, he was certified, and yes, he was inaugurated. But on election night, 2016, it was the networks that called the election because they could see which way the results were going, and Donald Trump became president, and Republicans rightfully celebrated. I mean, it does seem to me that this is becoming a bit like Groundhog Day. Yes, Joe Biden doesn't become president officially until he's inaugurated on January the 20th, and sure, there's no rush, and yes, we should do these recounts, and yes, the votes should all be certified. And I can understand why Trump supporters are upset at the result. I mean, my favorite soccer team lost last night. I would love it if they discovered that the referee was taking a bribe. I would love it if the other team had an illegal player. But it isn't going to happen. Eventually, you have to accept the results. America might not be able to move forward at the moment, but the rest of the world certainly is moving forward. World leaders are queuing up to make congratulatory telephone calls to Joe Biden, whether it's Angela Merkel or Boris Johnson. They are queuing up. We've even had a phone call between Joe Biden and Pope Francis, for heaven's sake. It is time for Donald Trump to recognize that the election is over. We know now that American networks have called Georgia and indeed North Carolina. Georgia for Joe Biden, North Carolina for President Trump. The final tally of Electoral College votes, according to American networks, is 306 to 232. It may be close in certain states, but that is the figures that 4 years ago Republicans were saying was a landslide victory.
Well, let me go back to you, Sol Montez Bradley. What do you make of what Ian has to say there? Even the Pope has agreed that Joe Biden is the victor. Should the Republican Party just accept the result? Sol Montez Bradley, have we lost our connection with you? I believe we do. Well, let me ask the same question to you, Amy Koch. Do you think you said before that you did think that the Republican Party should now move on, because effectively much of the rest of the world is now laughing at the Republican Party?
Well, you know, and also I don't want to, as a Republican, I would just like to say I think that had the result been different, I think that the Democrats also would have been crying, you know, questions about the voting, voter suppression, which is, you know, now it is the Republicans that are doing this. What I would just say to both sides, but particularly to my own party, is that there's something that's more, that party and country is more important than any personality or one person. And so we have to look at this and we have to think about the long-term effects of what we're doing and the integrity of the vote and making certain that it is that it is done properly, but also making certain that the election is not
Hello, now I
passed
can hear you.
is something that we need to be a party to. And so that, you know, when I look at this, it's count all the votes, but the cries of election frauds for election fraud without evidence is damaging not just to our party, but to the country as a whole. And we need to think about that.
Well, I gather we've reestablished a connection to Seoul, so you wanted to come back on that point.
Yeah, yes, indeed. For the little I heard just now, whether we call them fraud, glitches, administrative errors, human error, at this point it doesn't matter. There is enough out there to suggest that there are problems, and those problems need to be solved. We need to know why Henry John, Noreen Lucas, Joseph Barbano, Thomas Sullivan, George White, Judy Presto, and a hell of a lot of names that I have here were able to vote when they all have been dead for a number of years, actually. What kind of glitch happened there? There is a chap, William Bradley, who voted in Wisconsin, and we are told that his vote was attributed to him erroneously. That it was actually his son who voted. How did that happen? Why did a guy who died in 1984 get a mail-in ballot? And why, if he didn't return it, somebody else's was attributed to him? We need to clarify these things.
This is
well,
not.
I think we do absolutely need to clarify these things, and I think. Sorry, who was that? Was that you, Amy? Were you trying to jump in on that point?
Yeah, these are individual cases. The Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank, has found 1,200 of such cases since the 80s. These absolutely should not happen. These absolutely should be fixed and investigated as to why. But that's not evidence of widespread fraud, which is what is being alleged here. There's individuals in some states.
Not by me. Not by me. I said whether these are glitches, errors, fraud, or whatever it is, it needs to be explained. We have too many of these. And I hope, and as an American, I sincerely hope that over the next few weeks, we will clarify this, because we need a president proclaimed by the Electoral College in December with a majority of Americans accepting the result without question. Everybody should welcome.
Well, somebody who clearly does believe there has been fraud is President Trump. And Ian, you would have expected to have heard a lot from him this week, but it's been quite the opposite, hasn't it?
Yeah, so many questions to put to Donald Trump right now, but you're right, he hasn't answered a single one since Election Day. Remember his monologue in the White House briefing room last week, which was so factually wrong that most American networks cut away from it. That's the last time he's spoken on camera. But he ignored questions from the media and simply walked away. So we've had to rely on his tweets to figure out if he was still refusing to concede. And of course, there have been dozens of them. In some, he complains that Republican poll watchers weren't allowed to observe the count. They were. But there's a dispute over how close they could get. He claims this robbed him of hundreds of thousands of votes. Election officials, and indeed Twitter, dispute the claim. Sometimes he's so angry we get the all capitals tweets, in this case about the Dominion software company whose equipment is used in 24 states. Without evidence, he claimed that 2.7 million of his votes had been deleted. Now, a Dominion spokesperson said the company categorically denies any claims about any vote switching or alleged software issues with our voting systems. Our systems continue to reliably and accurately count ballots, and state and local election authorities have publicly confirmed the integrity of the process. Now, the other subject troubling Mr. Trump this week was the good news about the COVID vaccine from Pfizer, except he complained that the announcement should have been made before the election. Apart from these comments, Mr. Trump has had nothing to say about escalating deaths and hospitalizations. But some Trump loyalists have been willing to face questions about the election result and defend their boss's refusal to concede.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. All right, we're ready. The world is watching what's taking place here. We're going to count all the votes. When the process is complete, there'll be electors selected. There's a process. The Constitution lays it out pretty clearly. The world should have every confidence that the transition necessary to make sure that the State Department is functional today, successful today, and successful with the president who's in office on January 20th, a minute afternoon, will also be successful.
Anyone who's running for office can exhaust concerns about counting in any court of appropriate jurisdiction. That's not unusual. It should not be alarming. At some point here, we'll find out finally who was certified in each of these states, and the Electoral College will determine the winner, and that person will be sworn in on January 20th. No reason for alarm.
Mr. Trump tweeted his approval of Mike Pompeo's controversial statement. The question is, what are senior Republicans saying to him in private? And are they willing to tell him that he's lost? And if so, when?
And meanwhile, Democrats have hit out at Republicans backing Donald Trump's claim. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer was, among others, accusing them of jeopardizing U.S. democracy.
Republicans in Congress are spreading conspiracy theories, denying reality, and poisoning the well of our democracy. The Republicans should stop their shenanigans about an election that President Trump has already lost and focus their attention on the immediate issue at hand, providing relief to a country living through the COVID health and economic crises.
What are these false claims of widespread election fraud doing to our country right now?
It is one more step in delegitimizing not just the incoming Biden administration, but democracy generally. And that's a dangerous path.
Well, obviously, that was former President Barack Obama calling that a dangerous path. Let's bring in Tanya Washington again. So what, if anything, should Democrats be doing now?
Well, the process has to play out, but what we see is courts throwing out the cases that are being brought by President Trump, which means they're being thrown out not for lack of jurisdiction, but for lack of evidence. Meanwhile, in the court of public opinion, he is fanning the flames among his base supporters, who are half of the country. We are going to have to move forward as a people, as Americans on both sides of the aisle. And what he is doing is going to make it that much more difficult for us to work together to address the coronavirus, the rising rates of infection and death, and the economic crisis that is resulting from an out of control pandemic.
Now, the US networks have called Georgia for Joe Biden. The last time the state was called for a Democrat was in 1992. For Georgia, going from red to blue is a seismic event in US politics, but there is even more at stake. Republicans and Democrats are now concentrating on two key races that will determine who controls the all-powerful Senate. Robert Ray is in Georgia.
We have the most important runoff, perhaps in years, in the United States. 2 Senate seats up for grabs in a runoff, the election now January 5th. Millions of dollars being spent to try and get each candidate to win. Both parties have people coming in from across the country temporarily moving to the state of Georgia to campaign for Democrats and Republicans. Here's the importance of it. If the Republicans get those 2 seats that are now in the runoff, they get the full Senate. What that means is they have control of the Senate. The Democrats will have the President of the United States, with current President-elect Joe Biden waiting to see how this all turns out. And then the Republicans, if they win the Senate on January 5th, will have control of the Senate, which we know is clearly the most important thing in politics in the United States, with all the laws and the votes and everything that goes through. So lots of money being spent here in the state of Georgia right now. The Republicans certainly hoping that they win. The Democrats trying to stop that as much as they possibly can. And you can just sort of feel the uptick in the tempo here in the state and how important it really is. President Donald Trump still saying that he thinks that there's voter fraud out there. He will not concede until all the votes are recounted in the battleground states where there have been issues, including here in the state of Georgia. So we shall see as this tempo continues to go up, and the state of Georgia is under all eyes across the world, as this runoff really is so important for what happens in the United States in the next 2 years and perhaps even 4. Robert Ray, TRT World.
Well, let's go back to Republican strategist Sol Montez Bradley. So that was Robert Ray, who was in Georgia. And there is still quite a lot to play for in that state because the Senate race is still open. Is that why you are still backing President Trump? Well, let me put that same question to you, Amy Koch. I don't know if you heard it. I was saying that the Senate race in Georgia is still up in the air. There's still a lot to play for. And is that why you are standing behind President Trump?
Well, so maybe that's why other Republicans are standing behind President Trump. I, at this point, have sort of looked at the numbers and realized that, it is unlikely that he will be victorious. But I do happen to know Senator Perdue very well. I expect and feel confident about Republicans' chances with both those seats in Georgia, but they should not take it for granted, and I don't believe that they are for 1 second. They saw how close this race was in Georgia. It was a seismic event. If Georgia remains in Biden's column after the recounts, then this would be a very, very big move for the state of Georgia. And Republicans cannot take it for granted. There's been shifts along the political landscape, things moving to Republicans that you would never think before would be Republican. And the state of Georgia is something that has become in play. So perhaps there's some gamesmanship going on, but I also didn't see anything that Senator McConnell was saying any different than what I'm saying, what Tanya is saying, or what Saul was saying, which is President Trump has the right to follow through on this process and figure out if there was, recounts and all the legal machinations have been exhausted. So, and that's all that Senator McConnell really had to say in the message. Secretary Pompeo was different, but he's also talking about his boss, and even he sort of smirked, so I didn't necessarily believe what he was saying on that. But I think that the Senate is where all the attention now is going to be, and Republicans are not and will not take that for granted.
Let's go back to you, Tanya Washington. You are in Georgia. How does it feel for your state to have turned from red to blue?
There was dancing in the streets, but there was also a commitment at some of those demonstrations of celebration. People were registering folks to vote to make sure that we turn out in the same numbers that we turned out for the election on November 3rd. We had 67% voter turnout, which is just phenomenal. And we hope that we will register even more voters. I think it's great when more people vote. It's great for democracy. It's great for the parties that they are members of. And I also think that this Senate race, these Senate races, put a spotlight on Georgia that it deserves. We are going to flesh out the issues. We're going to make the best possible case for our Democratic candidates, John Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock. And I think both sides are committed to making sure that they win these seats. I hope that that can happen without the president continuing to inflame the passions of people and cast doubt on our democracy by raising unfounded allegations of voter fraud. If you have the information, if you have the evidence, present it in court and let the judges decide. But, tainting the court of public opinion in this way is incredibly dangerous for our democracy.
Well, I want to say thank you very much indeed to all my guests based in the US for joining us on the programme. That's Tanya Washington, Amy Koch and Sol Montez Bradley. Thank you very much indeed. And Ian Woods is still with us in the studio. So I've said it many times, an extraordinary election. What on earth is next?
Well, it's not over yet. It's still got some time to go. I mean, look, I am a complete US election nerd, and even I'm beginning to feel like it's Groundhog Day, and it is time to move on. Fox News journalist Geraldo Rivera, who I used to work with a few years ago, tweeted a short time ago that he had spoken to Donald Trump today and said that Donald Trump, he compared him to a heavyweight boxer who knew that he was behind on points, he was coming into the last round, he was going to be swinging wildly. He knew that a win was unlikely, but he was still going to fight to the bitter end. I would like to see the analogy being that Donald Trump has fought as hard as he possibly can. The referee should really be counting it out by now, but if he wants to carry on the distance, that's fine. But at the end, wouldn't it be great to see both fighters embracing at the end of this and saying it was a tough contest, but there's only can be one winner? Sometimes US presidents' reputations are enhanced after they leave office. Jimmy Carter became a great president, not when he was in office, but for what he did afterwards. George W. Bush has enhanced his reputation with Democrats since he left office by building a good relationship with Barack and Michelle Obama. I don't expect that's going to happen with Donald Trump. It's too much to hope for. But his legacy is important, and his legacy is being hampered by his refusal to accept reality. And if he can do that in the next few days or few weeks, then people will think better of him, continuing the transition, the tradition of a peaceful transition in American politics.
The voting may be over, but the controversy continues. Ian Woods, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And that's it from this edition of America Decides.